have your attention. My name's Ian Young, and I've got the very great honour to be Vice-Chancellor of the ANU. I'd like to, before I actually do the official welcome, I'd just like to say that in about 30 minutes' time I have to be at another spot across campus to open another lecture. So literally I'm going to have to speak and run, so I do apologise that I would have liked to have been here for the proceedings a little bit later on. But if I could begin by just acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. I'm delighted this evening to welcome Professor Barbara Norman, Head of the Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Canberra, and I'm welcoming her today as co-director of the Canberra Urban and Regional Forum. So CURF has become a very successful innovation between the Australian National University and the University of Canberra. And in addition to that role, Barbara also is an adjunct professor here at ANU. I would also like to welcome my University of Canberra and ANU colleagues, representatives here this evening from federal, local and regional government bodies, and of course friends of CURF from business and indeed from within the broader community. CURF has become a valuable research and education platform from which issues related to the Australian capital region can be shared and importantly discussed. In particular, the new ACT and New South Wales Memorandum of Understanding for Regional Australia has named CURF as one of the important stakeholders. This will become a critical role as issues such as sustainability, energy and water, adaptation and biodiversity in this region become increasingly important and indeed increasingly challenging. By hearing from experts in research and policy, such as Professor Dobers, the conversation can be harnessed to respond to these very significant challenges. I wish you all this evening that I'm sure you will have a very engaging and very informative time. And with that, I'd like to now hand over to Professor Will Steffen to commence the proceedings.
Right, thanks very much, Ian, for opening the proceedings tonight. I'd just like to give a couple of apologies. Mr. Michael Bryce, who's the patron of CURF, and Professor Stephen Parker, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra, couldn't be with us tonight, but they send their best wishes for the seminar. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and good friend, Steve Dobers, who's Director of the Fenner School of Environment and Society here at ANU, and has a wide range of research and education interests in environmental policy and institutions, disaster policy, natural resource management, climate adaptation, and integrated research strategies. So in that regard, Steve really reflects a lot of the breadth of interest and expertise at the Fenner School itself. He's written over 200 research publications and managed to do that whilst being a very effective director, which I admire greatly. I don't know how you do that, Steve, but somehow managed to keep it up. Some of the most important books he's written are Institutional Change for Sustainable Development, Environment and Sustainability Policy, and the Handbook of Disaster and Emergency Policies and Institutions. He's currently co-convener of both the National Institute for Rural and Regional Australia and the State of Australian Cities Research Network. He's a member of the National Wildlife Corridors Plan Advisory Group and serves on the board of the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network. He's Associate Editor of the Journals of Environmental Science and Policy and the Australasian Journal of Environmental Management, and serves on the editorial boards of Global Environmental Change and Local Environments. So it's indeed a great pleasure to have Steve as our second CURF seminar of 2012. And it's a fascinating topic for us tonight, Canberra as National Experiment and Laboratory for Sustainable Development, with a question mark. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for all coming along. And I should note, I am a University of Canberra alumni. What I'm going to try and do here this evening is pull together some separate existing arguments I've made in recent years and hopefully fashion a coherent-ish proposal. And it's a big proposition for a small city that Canberra could be a long-term experiment in human settlement. And some of these thoughts, I think, are relevant to the centenary next year, 2013, and what we might do on the way to 2113. I would say, stop me if you've heard this before, but I won't, because Canberra's a small place and I might not get very far. You might get an early drink in that case, but I'll hopefully put some things that some of you have heard before into a bit more context. So I've got a mixed academic heritage, crossing divides between natural science, social science and humanities. So to reflect that, tonight I'm going to partially read a paper in the humanities tradition. Then I'll use PowerPoints with dot points and even pictures on them like a scientist, and then, because my real discipline's public policy, I'll make some moderately realistic recommendations about the world we live in. Now, I have to apologise first, this is Canberra and regional, but I'm mostly going to talk about Canberra and the ACT, though the arguments can spread further to the capital region. But to remind us of what lies beyond the border, and to admit that I actually do come from New South Wales. Hands up else, who's from Queanbeyan? Thank you. Goulburn? Yes? Belconnen? So I'll start up with my sort of opening arguments for this. That should say starting points, not staring points, but please do look at the screen. I'd put it to you that there are some things we don't know. We do not have a detailed understanding of human movement, water, material and energy consumption and flows in cities, and how to run urban systems very well. We're not dreadful at it, but we don't know enough. We don't know how to conserve biodiversity and other ecosystem functions in and around a city. We have separated the city from nature and the urban from the rural far too often. And we certainly don't know the efficacy, the value of existing or possible policy and management interventions that we can make to achieve those things. And we don't have experiments or laboratories. My natural scientist colleagues can lock things up and experiment on them. They can go out and do things and run experiments. You can't actually do that with humans. It's a terribly upsetting part of social science. But we don't have laboratories where we can develop and test that knowledge. But tonight I'll argue that maybe we could. Maybe we do have a laboratory. You really want to see that one again, don't you? There used to be a T-shirt. So I'm going to explore in different ways some different propositions. The first is that we are still settling the limestone plains, including Canberra. My second proposition is that Canberra is not weird or exceptional, despite what some people, both inside in Canberra and outside, think. And that Canberra could be a testbed for innovation in sustainable urban development. And it even has a comparative advantage, actually a strong comparative advantage to be such a place. Long-term settling, sustainability and good policy needs long-term partnerships, long-term data and persistence. And that with respect to those things, we have some things in place already and some encouraging starts, but they are not fully utilised and not fully connected. So they're propositions which, in no particular order, I will try and run through. And they're going to add up to the overall argument that we could have in Canberra, the ACT, and possibly broader than that, but starting there at least, an internationally remarkable integrated knowledge system for sustainable development, connecting research, government, community and the private sector. And that would enable absolutely world-class evidence-based policy. That's apparently what we do nowadays, have evidence-based policy. I'm not sure what we had before. Shared understanding and exportable innovation and ideas. And just maybe a Canberra that is watched for good reasons, other than bad, and more valued than it is now by other Australians. So that's the overall claim I'm going to make. And now I'll do my still settling the limestone plains narrative, which some people have heard. It was the Sylvia Curley oration, a cut-down version now. 37 people attended that and several went to sleep because the fire was on in Mugger Cottage on a cold day. So even if you were there, you may hear something you didn't before. And the whole text is somewhere on the web. But the traditional Australian story of settlement, that word settlement, is insufficient and wrong. And while in recent years historians have rewritten the story of Australian settlement to be a bit more inclusive, I want to stretch that further, to unsettle the notion of settlement and argue we're still doing it. For many people, Australia was settled after European occupation through the actions of hardy, resourceful and sometimes foolhardy settlers. Later, those people departed our narrative, the narrative of the evolution of the Australian people and continent. They faded first from Sydney, which went from settlement to town and then to city, where settlers don't exist. Settlers hung on longer in the bush, but they faded away there as well in our narrative. It seems that once survey pegs are removed and houses are built, settlement stops. We've had other settlers cross the stage. New settlers is another term for migrant new Australians, and new settlers as alternative lifestylers escaping from deviant consumptive cities. But overall, the modern era put an end to settlers, settlement and settling, and they're now past tense. And that's wrong, for a few reasons. Firstly, human settlement of the Australian continent began well before white occupation, at least 50,000 years before, and it's an unfinished story. The second is the presumption that the process of settlement has stopped, and I'll come back to that. And third, the Australian settlement story largely overlooked urban Australia. Cities were a post-settlement phenomenon, devoid of settlers. So we had traditionally understood settlers on the Limestone plains and hereabouts from the 1830s. And things stayed that way until some startling new lines were drawn on a map in 1911 towards a new settlement that would utterly transform the region from rural to the eventual national capital in Canberra. One member of that survey team in 1911 was George Dovers, my grandfather. In previous times, there was a sense that the new Canberra was an important part of the national project of settlement. But of course, surveyors and others were here well before that. Mark Curry, coming through and down to the south, summed it up when he wrote, "The country has an interesting nature connected to sheep grazing." It was open, grassland between scattered trees. Further south, he claimed on the wonder of the clear downs. You could run stock without having to clear it. And why it was open is part of an ongoing story of human settlement that we're only just starting to understand. Some of the trees here, of course, you see driving around, predate white settlement. They're the standing dead of another era. They could be 300 years old. People rested in the shade of some of those before our best-known white settlers ever arrived. We now just argue about old trees in terms of biodiversity and occupational health and safety in our urban parks. Those early explorers and surveyors were part of the settlement story. They mapped country and divided it to owner and use and discovered what it was good for, but we're still doing that. Crace will be here in 100 years. And could it be a heritage-listed streetscape in 2113 when we celebrate a bicentennial? Planners and developers and home builders are part of the settlement story, just like Curry, Dixon and Burley Griffin and others were. And going back further, there's a deeper history of settlement that was for far too long overlooked and is still underrepresented in our story of settlement. Through the many centuries when the country was settled and stewarded by Australia's first peoples. We've improved in recognising and paying our dues, but white Australia has yet to reach an enduring settlement with Indigenous Australians. And the term settlement, I acknowledge, is highly problematic when we speak of Indigenous Australia, as the act of settlement, European settlement, was of course an occupation that was at times unthinking and at times violent. The term settlement in our historical narrative starts in 1788. It was a transition and an attempted conquest. But if people have been in Australia for millennia, the process of settlement has been going on for millennia and changing all the time. We're slowly getting used to that in Australia. Bill Gamage's recent book is the latest and rather monumental body of evidence in that argument. But too often we treat Indigenous management, land management, as either or both uniform and or static. And that's the next great leap of comprehension for people today. Hundreds of peoples and nations, over thousands of generations, living in, learning from and managing landscapes of great variability from the tropics to deserts to fertile river valleys to the Alps. How many lessons were learned? How many times did land management practices such as burning or harvesting change over the centuries? How enormously varied in space and time was that settlement? Settlement doesn't stop. Settlement is still continuing. It's an experiment. And if you don't learn from the experiment, you don't succeed. Indigenous people learned and succeeded for thousands and thousands of years. We've been at it for 100 with this particular settlement. Now let's fast forward to the urban age. There's another gap in the story of settlement, is it's largely non-urban, which is a bit odd given that the urban population of Australia exceeded the rural population from the middle of the 19th century. The bush and rural myth has been a minority experience for 3/4 of our post-occupation history, but it's very powerful. Cities don't feature much in our settler mythology. Urban Australia, in the story of white settlement, is mostly an aberration or an apology. A.D. Hope in the poem Australia. And her 5 cities, like 5 teeming sores, each drains her a vast parasite robber state, where second-hand Europeans pullulate timidly on the edge of alien shores. Canberrans can at least pullulate. You might have to look that up in the dictionary, and I won't attempt the noise. At a distance from alien shores, and you're safe from sea level rise. But cities have often been viewed as unnatural in the standard story of settlement. Teeming sores, parasites. From the 1820s, we had very clear visions expressed of the preferred society we should become. And it was rural, the sturdy yeomanry doing morally sound work on the farm and living on what was, and I quote from Cunningham, frugal prosperity. That ideal was briefly translated to the suburbs as a working man's paradise, but no longer holds. But whatever one's idea of the real Australia, whether it's city, suburb, town, paddock or bush, they're all real, they're all utterly independent. The city-country divide's mostly an artifice of politics and media, but it does have its roots in the settlement story. Many constructions of our heartlands in TV documentaries and books and research programs put the heart of our country in the country, or even the desert. In the excellent book Australian Heartlands, Brendan Gleeson provided a political, demographic and economic antidote and put the heart of the country in the suburbs. The cultural and economic and political heartland of Australia is suburbia, even if precious intellectuals and stoic agrarians might not like it. Are we still settling in the suburbs? Bloody oath we are, as individuals and collectively. And that's another problem with the settler myth. It's individuality. Even the back then mostly white male hardy individual settler of our myths was not so individual. Settlers were supported by public subsidy, irrigation systems, government survey, national development agendas, immigration assistance, convict transport, closest settlement schemes, land grants and the rest. Settling Australia has never been individualistic or just government driven or privatised or community organised, but a mixed bag. Strong intervention and collaboration have always been part of the story. The challenges of governing settlement have changed a lot over time, and many would think that the challenges of change and settling are greater and quicker now. But I'm not sure that they are. The challenges in the past were pretty challenging. Post-war urban growth, revising wartime production and consumption in city and bush, providing universal access to water and schooling, the impact of the car and the telephone, the advent of artificial lighting. Were these somehow lesser challenges and changes relative to the capacities of the time than what we face now? Probably not, and it's fairly irrelevant, because every era has challenges of settlement and running a society and deals with them well or not. So the last problem with the story of settlement is that it stopped. Settlers and settling was then, not now, or not even recently, and that's wrong. The story is ongoing of humans settling in this landscape, and I think we can comprehend our past, our present and our future better if we accept settlement, the notion of settlement as continuing, and a fascinating story that we're still part of. We are still settling the limestone plains, and we're still settling Australia, and we're still settling cities and suburbs and towns as much as we are the bush and the outback. Suburban subdivisions are settlement, as is tree planting in a country or city, densification of housing, saving a species, discovering something new about our soil or our climate, putting in water tanks, unearthing minerals, erecting public artworks along Canberra's roadways. And it's not just the big players that do it. It's farmers, builders, scientists, landscapers and the owners of backyards. And all of them are making mistakes and making improvements. And where does Canberra fit into this? Canberra's a quite peculiar part of the Australian settlement. It's a mix of national symbols, pre-designed suburbs and centres and bush settings. And from 1913 on, and for decades afterwards, Canberra conveyed a sense of shared nationhood, a place of pride, interest and shared symbols. But the word Canberra has become an insult, used to convey fault and resentment, I actually live in Queanbeyan so that I don't have to have ACT plates, and when I travel in rural New South Wales, I don't get mistaken for a Treasury official. This happens. Too many Australians have become conditioned by populist commentary from politicians and the media and have lost pride in the shared national capital. The shallowness of public debate in Australia and an incredible lack of connection with an understanding of our democratic system makes it a very easy form of populism. And I wonder if that could change. Apart from thoroughly endorsing Robin Archer's latest salvo in what has been a very long history of trying to correct media and political denigration of Canberra, I'd venture that such a resurrection could be helped in the longer term, in our interests, through achievement, and subtle achievement rather than argument. So now back to the modern era of PowerPoint and what this notion of settling might mean for us here, now, and into the future. So I'm going to expand on those propositions I put up earlier, which by now you've forgotten, and just thought he's rabbited on about settling a lot. Canberra is not that exceptional. Barbara, you'd relate to the fact that if you do work in urban studies in Australia and your case study is Canberra, people go, well, no, that's weird. It doesn't apply to anywhere else. Canberra's different. It's just 100% public servants. But it's not as exceptional as it's often thought to be. Particularly over the last decade or two, there is now much greater diversity across demography, land use, housing stock, climate, weather, economic activity. Canberra has become more diversified. And Canberra faces issues that are quite familiar elsewhere: climate adaptation, planning issues, managing growth on the urban edge, open space management, economic development, ageing, education, water, energy efficiency, transport. These are not unusual issues. So we're not that unusual, and we face the same issues, many of the same issues that Australia's other cities and towns face. So don't feel as weird as you did. So in terms of Canberra as a laboratory to draw lessons from, not only are we not weird or exceptional, I'd argue that the ACT in Canberra has an incredibly strong comparative advantage. You could not design a better laboratory than we have here. Absolutely unparalleled concentration of research capacity, 4 universities, CSIRO and all the rest of it. The status and profile of a national capital, which if used well, does attract attention of a good sort rather than a bad. Crucially, it's a single jurisdiction and containing a city, the city-state, with a stronger identity, and an incredibly unique thing in Australia. You combine local and state government functions. So as one Canberra bureaucrat once said to the state colleagues, yes, we write waste management policy like you do too, but we have to take the bins out. This is actually quite profound. This doesn't happen anywhere else in Australia. And we have a potentially coherent planning framework within which to manage these things. Canberra has a meaningful but manageable, it's big enough to matter, but it's small enough to be manageable in terms of understanding urban function and governance. Canberra can actually speak to larger cities and smaller towns. We have significant natural areas which are fascinating and interesting to manage. We're also only one of the only 2 places in Australia that has a dual sector utility, the energy and water. That is a rare, particularly in terms of data and understanding systems, is a rare thing. We have that increasingly diverse housing stock and employment patterns, and we have cross-border issues. And we're getting on top of some of those. Put those together, and if you wanted to pick a place to do applied policy relevant research and improve the way we do things, Canberra comes out head and shoulders above anywhere else in Australia. The other proposition was that it requires long-term partnerships, long-term data, and properly structured experiments that connect the two. Things change slowly in cities, and they change very slowly in the systems we're embedded in of forests and water systems. And our policy and technological interventions that we make, could make, might make, take a long time to produce a result, to be implemented, and to be evaluated. So whatever we do in this space that I'm arguing has to be sustained. We have to persist with it because ad hocery and amnesia have been the worst feature of Australian environmental and resource and urban management. And I said we'd already started. We have some good building blocks, but not enough connected yet. Much is happening, and Kirk is an advance in mapping some of this, getting people onto the same page, but we are not at full potential and we're not connected. So just some examples, and these are from my own school, the Fenner School, which is obviously the best in the ANU. In partnership with the ACT government, the Land Development Agency, CSIRO, and often through students who are a marvellous resource. Some call them cheap labour, they're not. Mulligan's Fat Guru, I got that right for once, woodland experiment on the edge of Gungahlin. That is absolutely world-class science, conservation and public recreation and scenic and amenity in one place. We have the beginnings of some nationally notable fine-scale work in water and energy consumption and management, an incredibly long and productive history in catchment and water quality work. We have some of the best work going in urban fringe conservation, both science and social science, of how you actually have people in houses near valuable natural assets. We have ongoing links in the region on working farms such as out at Mulloon and more. So we do have a lot happening, and often it is in partnership with agencies, with landholders, with community groups, but we do not, even despite the best efforts of Perth, and I'm sorry I haven't updated the website for a while, we need to do more about mapping what this incredible concentration of research capacity, absolutely globally remarkable, has. So a few areas where I think Canberra could actually take the lead, where we have comparative advantage, capacity, and we're already doing things and could become not just nationally notable, but internationally significant. One is in urban vegetation and urban forests. I told you I'd mention that, Chris, and I have. We have a strong basis already from people such as Chris Brack and others. We have better data than probably anywhere else. We have interesting species diversity in our urban forests. Highly valued in the landscape, which is why we argue about them. Varied urban form and evolving urban form. It is a brilliant laboratory to look at the multiple aspects of vegetation in the urban system. Biodiversity in an urban context, the bush capital, brilliant laboratory. We have multiple reserve urban edges. We have existing landscape ecology and conservation biology capacity absolutely at the forefront with internationally remarkable scientific work going on. Strong community interest in managing nature and biodiversity in and around the urban system, and again a suitable planning framework within which to make the decisions that could be informed. And the ACT, you may not know it, in collaboration with New South Wales, I believe, having recently been involved in the Minister's Wildlife Corridors Advisory Group, the absolute world's best information basis for cross-tenure and jurisdiction connectivity conservation. It blows the rest of the states out of the water, and Australia blows most other countries out of the water. It's absolutely fantastic. Got to have pictures, and you've always got to have a nice furry animal. That's a bettong. That's the predator-proof fence. Thank you, John Stanhope, at Mulligan's Flat. And just a visual to say we already can. We know how to structure world-class science, high-quality conservation, and public recreation and amenity in the one place. It is an utterly globally remarkable thing that's happening out there. Some of my colleagues probably say, don't say that, we'll get lots of people out there. Other areas where I think Canberra has a particular, or the ACT in this region has a particular role that it could play is in bushfire and fuel management. It's highly topical. I get more hate mail about bushfires than any other area of science we research in. We have a high research and management capacity between ANU and CSR and so on. We have good past data, and we have multiple and variable sites, and we have the capacity to do long-term monitoring in that area, which is an unbelievably poorly supported area with empirical research that can actually inform policy, and it's very important. Urban energy and water management. I mentioned we have a dual sector utility. These are classic issues to Canberra, significant issue for the future, and we potentially have the best capacity to actually run real management experiments in energy and water management, and at a manageable scale. Pretty hard to do it right across Sydney. What can you do with such data? You may look at that for a while and realise it's not Canberra, but I have a Charles Darwin University affiliation, so I always have to put up Darwin. That's the minimal one where you can actually start to look at what happens in a city in terms of the extreme variability of energy, and it works with water as well. Consumption across different parts of a city, they are very heterogeneous, and you can actually start to look at what happens under different forms of housing stock and urban form. We could go much, much further than that. We could actually have evidence-based energy and water management. You may think we have it already. I'd be sorry to disappoint you. Another area where ACT, Canberra and its institutions and people have an incredible advantage is in catchment and water quality, catchment management and water quality. We have a long history of work well documented in the Cotter and Dugong catchments. We have very high capacity in water science and water policy around the town. We have good data, and that is an issue of local and wider importance. And just the fact that we're having a couple of wet years, don't worry, it'll come back. The other one where we have a potential competitive advantage is linking research, training and monitoring. There are ecological plots in Australia with 27 years of continuous data. The data is collected by undergraduate students as part of their field training. Unfortunately, these sites are not connected to the ACT. To construct long-term research experiments tied to policies and programs is incredibly powerful. But most agencies do not have the capacity, often programs change, to keep that monitoring going. Universities teach methods. We teach people how to count trees and measure dirt and do all those sorts of things. Running field courses is a lot of work. David, do you know where I'm talking about? Kinchega. It's still going, Uni of New South Wales. It's hard to run field courses. So I propose that there's a major opportunity with our wealth of tertiary training programs to actually connect with public agencies, private sector, community groups in a structured way over time to meld methods training, the skills we need, with the monitoring needs we need to be able to actually feed into policy and management programs. Long-term tracking is our biggest problem in Australia. At one point we counted the nationally significant long-term ecological research sites in Australia. There were 6. 4 of them were run by one person called David Lindemeyer. We do not have that, and we don't have it in cities. It's a real problem, and here we've got a city, and here we've got 4 tertiary institutions, and it's an unbelievable opportunity. So, some of you may have other ones. They're ones I'm aware of. There could be areas where we can wire this city as an experiment in transport, in other aspects of building performance, and utilise the research strength, the community interest, and all of that. Could we actually be the remarkable integrated knowledge management system testbed for sustainable development? I think we could. I'm proposing a flexible, long-term collaborative partnership across research, policy, community and private sectors, with the collection, storage and widely accessible and easily connected data sets at as fine a scale as possible, that's crucial, maintained for useful time series in a highly connected way. And that would allow us to have informed creation, tracking, evaluation and adjustment of innovative strategies for our own good to run an absolutely world-class, sustainable and humanly desirable settlement towards this. Yeah, that's the laboratory. I can't think of anywhere in the world that could beat us on those comparative advantages. Some cities have become very well known for this sort of thing with much less of a basis, I believe, than Canberra could have, and to an extent does have already. And it matches national policy agendas and national social agendas. The focus of the Council of Australian Governments in recent years on lifting our game in strategic metropolitan and city planning towards integrated strategic planning and development, evidence-based. That's what I'm talking about. The Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network that I'm involved in is doing a lot of work. What infrastructure do we need for research in urban Australia? We don't need a supercomputer, we don't need a telescope, we don't need a machine that goes ping, we need the data. And this is a major effort, which Barbara is also involved in unleashing those data, making them available, making them able to be connected. The major increased investment terrestrial ecosystems research network rolling out across Australia, which ANU is active in, is part of the recognition of the crucial importance of good data and monitoring and the weaknesses we have in trying to manage natural and semi-natural Australian landscapes without good underpinning data and long-term monitoring. And the currently draft National Wildlife Corridors Plan is one manifestation of how we are moving inexorably towards not managing bits of the landscape to conserve biodiversity, but managing across landscapes, across jurisdictions. And as I said, that's an area where Canberra, ACT, collaboratively with New South Wales, is already a leader. So there's some national agendas, and I propose Canberra can be a leader in those. What we need to put together the bits of the puzzle, the participants, and now here's where we get to herding cats. The participants are research providers, our research institutions, government, in particular the ACT government, but also the Commonwealth and neighbouring governments, community NGOs and the private sector. Another part is some form of institutional or administrative setting, but much more network work than structure. I'm not talking about the Canberra Experimental Laboratory Authority with lots of bureaucrats in it, although that may be a good thing, but much more network, gluing the bits together. But it needs a mandate. It needs a mandate that is agreed. Do we get bipartisan political agreement in Australia? But is agreed as something good to do for the long term, not just something for the next couple of years. We need the resources. Funding probably isn't the biggest one of the resources. It's the people, the skills, the cooperation, the ability to be open with data sets. And underneath it, crucially, is data. Collected in useful forms, interoperable, this is a new word for me, but it means you can actually connect two data sets together, so when you want to do energy consumption, you can actually match the census. Custodianship, and above all, accessibility. We're entering supposedly an era of open government and data accessibility, but I remain to be convinced that there's much reality. And also we need a widespread acceptance that the evidence, we might not like what it comes up with. That's the problem with evidence-based policy, is often the evidence doesn't support the policy that a government wants or you personally may think is the right thing to do. I once got booed early in my academic career because we actually said that reusable milk bottles weren't as environmentally sound as everyone thought they were. I couldn't believe there was so much passion involved in milk bottles. Come to the city form or other big issues or population, you get even more contestation, but we do have to accept that if we really do track what we do in cities and we have good evidence about alternative transport, about housing form, about energy efficiency, some of us might not like the answers. So the reality check is what would get in the way of such a vision? Vaguely decent idea, can we do this? One barrier is what it's meant to overcome, which is silos and fragmentation. That's in research, between institutions, within institutions, between disciplines, across policy agencies. We specialise, and specialism's a great thing, but when we have something that is bigger than the specialties, we have the problem of integration. Politics, both short-term and in the future. Community engagement. This has to be something that many Canberrans would think is a good idea. And we have a very scattered private sector in Canberra without critical mass. So we have a lot of isolation and competition we'd have to get over. And we have the tyrannies of the short term. This is only worth doing if it is a long-term endeavour. A lot of people desire instant gratification and have short attention spans. And this is something that will flow out over years and decades. And of course we have elections and budget cycles. We have limited ability in programs through forward estimates, and we have short-term cycles of funding in research. And we lack time series in key data, and that's something that I suggest we have to commit to in the long term to get over. We do have a wariness of unsettling findings, or of being found that your favourite policy intervention, whether it's a dual flush toilet rebate or a new planning idea, actually doesn't work. But also I don't think we have a vision and a sustained forward debate, and I think we need to articulate that So I'd recommend to people next year to go to 2113 A Canberra Odyssey, which the Canberra Museums and Galleries are mounting. Rather than celebrate the last 100 years, as everyone else would do, let's push out and think about what the place would look like in 2113. And the biggest barrier is that so much of this is everyone's business but no one's responsibility. And over the past 2 or 3 years where this discussion's been had in some meetings, everybody thinks it's a great idea, but no one can take the lead because it's not their job. That relates to the first point of silos and fragmentations. But we could start small. We can properly map better our existing discrete activities and the partnerships that we have already, and Kirk has started us on that route. We can plan forward to supplement and extend and maintain those. The outstanding Mulligan's Flat experiment lasts as long as the ARC funding does. If anyone wants to donate, they can. We can identify community and policy and social goals that aren't covered yet. What's important? What do we argue about? What we don't understand? We have some of the building blocks in place, but are there things we're not working on? And then we can identify data sets, gaps, and start to work on protocols for actually getting the collaboration going, put in place some not onerous, but some well-meaning collaborative agreements. And we can have a discussion about the larger vision of this. So we can step our way to it in baby steps. So I don't do conclusions. I hope I've got across an idea, which is a big proposition for a small city, but with some valuable steps we can do along the way. So the question is it appealing, is it viable, and who could do what? And we could make the next 100 years count. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and I'll do a proper thank you at the end. Steve's very kindly happy to take questions. We've probably got about 15 minutes for questions, so I'll guide the traffic, as they say. So, first question.
Guide the traffic sounds like
I'm a planner. I'm a planner. Yes.
I've often thought that Canberra would be a wonderful experiment in zero fare public transport. We have a situation where I think fares only contribute 20% of the cost of running our public transport. About half of that is because we charge fares. So the 10 or less than 10% increase in money from the taxpayer's pocket, there would be no fares at all. And it would be the biggest city in the world to tackle it, although it might be about to be overtaken by Hawaii. What do you think of that sort of problem?
A couple of responses to that. In 1990, we ran a discussion and a process on sustainable development for the ACT because it was Our Common Future had come out and we were having a national ecologically sustainable development bit of thinking. And a British economist who I worked with on that, Nick Common, at the first meeting he said, put a shop and a pub on every corner and make the buses free. To which the planners said, you're crazy, you're mad. Toward the end of the project, those actually started to re-emerge again as actually quite sound ideas. So you don't actually often have to analyse much to come up with a good idea. That's the sort of thing we could test. And I'm sure people who operate those new machines that you get your bus ticket from would probably thank you greatly. There may be one of them in the audience. We could test that. I mean, that's the sort of innovation, the sort of idea, but we usually try those things not in a very well-coordinated way. So I'd suggest you trial it on some routes. You have the public discussion, you put this idea forward, you try and get people to understand the economics of our the finance of our public transport system, and run some of those varied trials and see if it works. And then be able to, at the end of a 6-month trial, see it. And you might even get someone to do that for their honours thesis, or a researcher to propose it as a research idea, do it, publish it, get it out there, solid information. So they're the sorts of innovations, and I don't do transport. Well, I do. I drive a car. Yeah, some scholarships. But that's the sort of thing you could actually test explicitly and find out whether it's a good idea or not for Canberra, but also have that as the sort of thing. Canberra tried something interesting.
I did have the previous Chief Minister on side, and I have the Canberra Business Council on side. However, the argument against it was that too many people would use public transport.
Well, look,
That's
we
wonderful.
are in a problem with public transport in Australia where we're on a catch-22 of it doesn't make enough money to invest in, and if we invested in it, it might make more money. It's been going on for years.
Good suggestion. Same suggestions being canvassed in central Melbourne. Question here and then.
Have you actually overcome the short-term political decision-making process and funding compared with some of these issues that are going to need long-term research?
That's one of the biggest barriers. Usually people talk about electoral cycles as things change, and that does happen. But you can set things up in a way that they are somewhat more proof to short-term political change. I think one of the biggest barriers is actually public finance. And I understand why forward estimates is very important, because if you don't have them, you spend more than you have and you go broke and it's a mess. But to look at ways of supporting, and there's a discussion going on around Australia and the world about how you actually support long-term monitoring that is necessary for public policy and management away from the forward estimate cycle. And we're starting to get longer-term agreements of funding in place. One is actually for governments to spend upfront by endowment over a longer period of time. You'll quit within one budget cycle, but you spend over a longer time. But you're right, it is very difficult. And things like the ARC reducing fellowships down to 3 years was absolutely incredible change. It's cruel, the idea of longer-term research. So we actually get more and more short-term. But I think there are clever ways of doing that in particular projects and streams.
Steve, in your address you highlighted all the advantages which Canberra has, in particular the intellectual capital, and I think few people would dispute that. One issue you didn't address, which potentially might hold back all those achievements, is the form of governance we have in the city. And I think there's plenty of evidence to show that disagreement between the ACT government and the NCDC has been a major problem.
NCDC.
But if you look at a huge decision which relates to the previous question about transport, the opportunity cost of constructing the GDE in terms of transport sustainability, which is intrinsic to your talk, is enormous. And therefore, an opportunity to build a much more sustainable transport system was severely dented. So the question is, do you think we really need to have a different form of governance in this city in order to achieve the results which you're all proposing could be by this amalgamation of all this intellectual firepower?
ACT, as I'm not an ACT voter, I can say what I like. But Winston Churchill, the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy is the worst system in the world except for all the others. I'd suggest that ACT, whatever issues one has with the governance and the relationship with the Commonwealth, is in a better position to do things well than, for example, in New South Wales or in Victoria possibly. So, one could possibly improve it, but I think it's still an ideal place. The city and the local and state government functions being rolled together, the moderate size which allows for a much greater dialogue between government and population than, what other place apart from Darwin do you get the Chief Minister on public radio talking directly to people about cracks in the pavement? I love listening to that. So I think it's possibly not as bad as we think, but we still make the same mistakes in our settlement as everywhere else does. I think the GDE probably in the national scale of transport waste of money is pretty moderate compared to what you can see in some other places. So I think if we worked harder, you could make the ACT governance system work much better than it does, and it would be much better than elsewhere. If we can't do this in Canberra, Where can you do it?
I'm going to go over here and a lot of questions. Got questions, probably time for about 3 or 4. One at the back and then Andrew.
Thanks. Thank you, Steve. That was really interesting. You focused very much on the kind of front end of institutional change and sort of structural change, the kinds of pieces of the puzzle that might fit together to make this, beautiful project, series of projects happen. I wanted to get back to the notion of community engagement and kind of ask you to answer your own question of whether it is appealing. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what we know about Canberrans' engagements in these issues and the degree to which they care. They're willing to, put their own kind of micro-geographical research to aid sort of projects like this. I mean, what do we know about, what the punter on the street out there thinks about this sort of thing? Because that's what drives political engagement to some degree.
My broad and hardly informed opinion, which I'm always quite happy to proffer, is that there is a higher level of identification with the city and its immediate hinterland in Canberra than in larger cities. I mean, people say they're from Sydney, but they're not really. And comprehending the entirety of the city system is really difficult. In fact, people are not from Sydney. They're from the North Shore or the western suburbs or somewhere. And I think that applies also in Melbourne and so on. So I think there is an identification. There's also an identification with the idea of the city as the bush capital, as a particular physical setting. So I think that's a strength. I'm not sure that deliberative democracy in Canberra is, on a global scale, particularly outstanding, but it's certainly not too bad. There is a level of engagement, and I know from specific research projects the willingness of individuals and individual households to actually be engaged in this sort of work in terms of data gathering and giving feedback to things is really quite strong. Now, whether we've stretched it to the limit and people will get sick of it, I'm not sure, but I think it's probably better placed, I think not probably, but definitely better placed than most other substantial sized cities in Australia. But that identification is the scale and the ability to identify with the city as an entity. You don't actually hear too many people saying, I'm from Tuggeranong, in the same way as I'm from the western suburbs. Not that I'm comparing the two at all. So there is that identity.
With the football team. And where was I? Down at the front, Andrew, did you want?
I'll let you go.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You can try again.
I think we're going up to the ACT Treasury. Yes.
Have you found any other examples of city-states around the world that talk about together?
There are, in different areas of, my area of resource and environmental management, there are cities which are very well known around particular issues, such as Vancouver, Copenhagen in some ways, Kurapita. They're known for doing some things. Quite often that does fade after a while. There's a bit of a hump. Not in a fully integrated way. And if you looked at places that have the single governance, the sufficient scale, and also the slight separateness, it's like in ecological work, islands are fantastic because they're uncontaminated. Economic work as well. But, Canberra as a discrete entity, there aren't many candidates that could do that. Singapore is one where a lot of this kind of work is being done, but in a very highly different context. So there's some competition out there, but I think we could certainly come in the top 8.
Last one.
I just want to follow up with the last comment. Actually, internationally, there are a couple of examples where a city has really stepped in and then developed a very integrated, comprehensive research program. For example, like the long-term ecological research station in USA, like Baltimore and Phoenix. The program has been going on for more than a decade, And they have, had this basic research up until to the, governance sort of interaction. And also in China, like Shanghai, Beijing, and Xiamen City, they all joined this long-term ecological research network. And I think this sort of network has really offered opportunities not only for the research, but also for the city itself, because those cities has really had lots of sort of spotlight in international arena, and they have also been gaining a lot. So I just wanted to point out there are some examples and good examples in the impact.
I think in long-term ecological research, there's Australia's actually quite outstanding, but there are various examples around the world, and there's an increasing move for those to actually talk to each other and learn about how to do this kind of thing. And if Canberra was serious about this, that would be a conversation to have with the ones such as you mentioned, but in particular aspects with other ones which are, particularly interested in transport only or energy only. So that, there could be a potential global community of these, much more to the extent there is now, and with an Australian paid up accredited member.
Okay, thank you, Steve. All right, it's my pleasure to my pleasure to just say thank you to Steve. We work on a number of things together, and I think that Steve's talk really reflected what I think is a very deep knowledge and experience about a whole range of landscapes that he just spoke about. So I think Steve, although he's a boy from Queanbeyan, Steve puts Queanbeyan in nearly every talk he gives because he just likes to remind us of where he comes from. Very proud of that. But I think that the issue of our laboratory is innovative. I think it does extend the notion of CAF, and thank you for recognising CAF's contribution and the beginnings of this. And I think that between us, and I think that's the point, between all of us in this room, we can make this whole concept, these links between research, public policy and the community in many of the ways that Steve's suggested tonight, make it just stronger and stronger. So I thank you very much for your contribution. It was an excellent talk, and please join me in thanking Steve.